At 6:47 a.m., my rooster crowed, and a furious scream echoed back from a pastel camping tent pitched dead center on my back pasture. The scream wasn't human in the traditional sense. It was the high-pitched, nasally war cry of HOA Karen, who had apparently declared squatters' rights on my property sometime after midnight. I stood barefoot on my porch, coffee in hand, wearing pajama pants patterned with little goats, and watched in utter disbelief as Karen unzipped her tent with the determination of a suburban warrior queen rising to meet battle. Her hair was in curlers, her face was covered in avocado-colored cream, and she wore a t-shirt that read, "Zen is power." Zen apparently meant trespassing. This woman had parked her Prius by the edge of the woods, dragged a full camping set across 2 cow paths, and assembled a makeshift glamping site right beside my irrigation ditch. And now, arms flailing like a weather vane in a tornado, she was yelling about meditative rights and restorative justice of the earth. I didn't know what she was talking about. I was still trying to process why a 60-year-old HOA president with a known hatred for livestock was now sharing real estate with my sheep. She waved a laminated paper in the air like it was a royal decree. I squinted. It said, HOA Wilderness Wellness Permit. The logo at the bottom looked suspiciously like it had been copied from a yoga mat. I walked over, keeping my distance like you would with a rattlesnake or a malfunctioning drone. Karen, I said slowly, why are you camping on my land? She snorted and pulled out a tiny folding stool from inside the tent, sitting down as if we were about to have a tea party instead of a property dispute. I've submitted a temporary encampment extension to the HOA for wellness immersion, she said. This land, spiritually speaking, is part of the communal wellness zone. I blinked. The only things communally enjoying this zone were my goats, who were currently sniffing around her tent ropes and debating whether her flip-flops were edible. Karen had been a thorn in the entire neighborhood's side since the day she became president of the HOA. She patrolled the community like a sheriff in a spaghetti western, only instead of guns, she carried printed citations for things like unauthorized wind chimes or overgrown ornamental grass. She once fined an 83-year-old war veteran because his birdbath disrupted aesthetic harmony. But this was a new level. I asked again, more forcefully, did you ask permission to camp here? She looked at me like I had offered her roadkill for brunch. Nature doesn't require permission, she said, her tone syrupy and smug. Besides, the HOA map shows this land in the optional oversight zone. I'm technically not trespassing. I went back inside and pulled out the official zoning map from my file cabinet. Not only was my land privately owned, it had been deeded to my family for 3 generations. I snapped a picture of Karen's tent from the window and sent it to my cousin Mark, who worked at the county clerk's office. His response was a single emoji, popcorn. But something wasn't sitting right. Karen didn't even like being near trees. She once tried to have a community oak tree cut down because the leaves fell inconsistently. Why would she voluntarily live outside, on a farm, surrounded by dirt and the exact animals she hated? I had a gut feeling there was more to this than just her love of Zen. That night, after the sun dipped behind the barn and the cows started to settle, I walked out with a flashlight and circled Karen's tent. She was inside, talking on the phone in a hushed but urgent tone. I couldn't make out all the words, but a few stood out: fundraiser, wellness center, soft launch, and back pasture expansion. My pulse spiked. She wasn't just trespassing. She was testing the waters. If she could claim my land under some fake spiritual nonsense, she might try to stake more. Maybe even convince the HOA to rezone parts of the rural boundary. The next morning, I found a printed flyer jammed into my mailbox. Coming soon, the Serenity Spiral Retreat Center. Brought to you by HOA Forward Progress. At the bottom, in small print, it read, Proposed Communal Development Zone pending neighborhood feedback. That was when I knew Karen wasn't camping. She was squatting with a blueprint. And she was doing it under the radar, betting on the fact that most of us farm folks didn't bother checking the HOA bulletin board. She ran like a monarchy. I called a meeting with a few neighbors who'd also had run-ins with Karen. Bob from 2 farms over, who she once ticketed for aggressively festive pumpkins, showed up with a cooler full of lemonade and fire in his eyes. Janine, who ran the local animal rescue, brought her parrot, which promptly squawked, "Karen's a loon," every few minutes. We put our heads together and pieced it all out. Karen was trying to use the HOA as a front to develop a boutique retreat on land that didn't belong to her. Her plan involved creating a therapeutic landscape that coincidentally covered the entire south end of my property. That night, I stood in my barn with the moonlight cutting through the wooden slats, staring at my industrial-strength farm hose. It was meant for cleaning out animal stalls and irrigation ditches, but it could also launch water 40 feet with the power of a liquid freight train. Karen's tent had no clue what was coming. I moved quietly before sunrise, dragging the hose across the field and placing it just out of sight behind the chicken coop. Then I waited. Karen emerged at dawn, yawning dramatically like a soap opera star, stretching her arms to the heavens. She did a few limp yoga poses and lit what smelled like lavender incense. My goat, Darla, watched her with the same judgmental expression I had. I gave Karen one final chance. I stepped out, hands on hips, and called, "Last warning, Karen. Pack up and leave. Or it rains." She scoffed. "You wouldn't dare." I dared. The hose hissed to life. The stream hit her tent like a firetruck intervention. The lavender incense went flying. Karen screamed. Darla bleated. My rooster crowed. And somewhere inside me, years of pent-up HOA injustice got hosed away in one glorious, soggy blast. And that was just the beginning. She screamed like the water had committed a hate crime. I stood there gripping the farm hose like it was Excalibur, and I was defending my ancestral land from suburban invaders. Karen's tent collapsed under the pressure in a fantastic, sloshy heap of soaked canvas, scented candles, and what looked like a box of essential oils that had given up on life. She stumbled out, dripping wet, mascara streaking like war paint, shrieking about emotional assault and flood-based terrorism. My goat Darla trotted away smugly, her hooves daintily avoiding puddles as if she'd just orchestrated the whole thing. Karen, flailing like an inflatable car dealership tube man, pointed at me with the rage of 1,000 petty citations. "You'll pay for this," she bellowed, dragging a soaked throw pillow behind her like a flag of defeat. "This is a violation of my civil tranquility." I calmly shut off the hose and leaned against the coop, sipping my now-cold coffee. "Civil tranquility doesn't come with trespassing rights," I replied, watching her wring out her HOA t-shirt, which now clung to her like a soggy political statement. Less than 2 hours later, I got a knock on my door. Not a tap or a polite knock. A full-blown HOA-style bang. Karen had changed into a fresh outfit, but her rage hadn't dried a bit. She was flanked by 2 other board members. Helen, who once fined me for letting my sunflowers lean over the fence, and Greg, who smelled like peppermint and disappointment. They marched into my yard like they were serving a warrant. Karen waved a clipboard in my face. "You've been summoned to a special HOA emergency meeting," she said, her tone sugary with menace. "Effective immediately." I followed them down the road to the community center, still wearing my boots and a t-shirt that read, "Don't tread on my pasture." The meeting had already been stacked with Karen's supporters. It was like walking into a town hall hosted by the Stepford wife. They glared at me like I'd committed sacrilege. Karen stood at the front like a dictator giving a TED Talk on personal vendettas. "Today we must address the violent actions taken by one of our more rugged residents," she announced, shooting me a look like I was chewing tobacco and threatening squirrels. She proceeded to spin the story like she'd been waterboarded in her sleep. "I was conducting a peaceful wellness retreat when I was ambushed by a weaponized farm tool," she declared, holding up a soggy dreamcatcher as evidence. "This is what tyranny looks like." I raised my hand. "That's not tyranny. That's a hose." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, but Karen's death glare silenced them. He used military-grade water pressure against a senior citizen in pursuit of spiritual healing. Then something unexpected happened. Ted, one of the newer board members, stood up. A retired postal worker with a mild manner and an impressive collection of beyond-the-lookout ties, Ted rarely spoke unless weather patterns were involved. But today, he cleared his throat and said, "Actually, I looked up the property lines last night. That land is fully owned by the farmer here." "Karen, you're the one in violation." Gasps echoed across the room. Karen's face turned the color of sunburnt strawberries. "Ted," she hissed, "I told you that land was part of the shared buffer zone." Ted shook his head. "That buffer zone you marked on the new HOA map doesn't exist in any official registry. You just drew a circle around his field and labeled it Future Mindfulness Garden." The room murmured. Some of Karen's minions exchanged nervous glances. Greg looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Helen stared at the ceiling tiles like they might offer answers. Karen tried to salvage control. Regardless, the violent response was unjustified. "He attacked my tent. My sacred space." I raised my hand again. It was either the hose or letting my ram handle the situation. I chose mercy. That was when the vote happened. Ted proposed a motion to censure Karen for trespassing and misusing HOA resources to print fake permit. It was like watching a dam break. Hands shot up, including a few longtime board members I thought were permanently fused to Karen's hip. She stared around in shock as the vote turned against her. "You're all sheep," she snapped. "You let one goat-loving lunatic manipulate you." Ironically, Darla had followed me into the meeting and let out a perfectly timed bleat. The room erupted in laughter. Karen stormed out, vowing revenge. "You haven't heard the last of me," she yelled over her shoulder. "I have lawyers. I have footage. I have influence." Ted turned to me with a small smile. "I think you might want to keep your hose ready. Just in case." That night, I tried to enjoy the quiet. The stars were out, the goats were fed, and the world felt a little more sane. But the peace didn't last. Around midnight, I heard something, rustling near the barn, a low metallic clunk. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside, boots thudding against the damp ground. The barn door was ajar. Inside, feed buckets had been knocked over, tools scattered, and worse, Darla's pen was empty. I checked every corner, called her name, even searched the edge of the woods. Nothing. That's when my phone buzzed. No caller ID, just a text with a picture. It was Darla, looking mildly confused, standing in what looked like Karen's backyard, next to a plastic garden flamingo and a statue of Buddha holding a solar-powered lantern. The message read, "Your goat is in a safe, spiritually aligned location. Return property rights to the HOA or she stays." Karen had kidnapped my goat. She didn't just want revenge, she wanted leverage. And she thought Darla was the key. I stared at the phone, a slow burn rising in my chest. I wasn't just dealing with a nosy neighbor anymore. I was in a full-on turf war. And she had just crossed the line from annoying to unhinged. I texted back one word: mistake. Then I reached for my boots and called Ted. "We've got a goat to rescue." When a woman kidnaps a goat, she forfeits her right to the moral high ground. I stared at the blurry photo Karen had sent me, Darla standing in a manicured backyard surrounded by lawn ornaments, a half-deflated exercise ball, and what appeared to be a fake koi pond. The goat looked unharmed but deeply unimpressed, her sideways glare aimed directly at the garden gnome that was now her only roommate. Karen had crossed every line of decency and sanity. She hadn't just trespassed. She hadn't just tried to build a fraudulent wellness center. She had declared psychological warfare with the strategic abduction of a farm animal. I called Ted first. He answered with a groggy, "This better be about a goat," and when I confirmed it was, he was wide awake within seconds. 10 minutes later, he was parked in my driveway, wearing a camouflage jacket and carrying a walkie-talkie like he was heading into a mission. "We'll need recon," he said. "You got drones?" I stared at him. Do I look like someone who has drones? But then I remembered. The Johnson kid 2 blocks down, Owen, was a drone hobbyist. Also a bit of a mischief maker, which meant he'd be perfect for this job. I called him up, and within half an hour, we were huddled around a tablet in my living room, watching live drone footage of Karen's backyard. Her place looked like a spa brochure written by someone with a Pinterest addiction and a grudge. Hammocks, hanging wind chimes, chakra stones arranged in a spiral, and right in the middle, Darla, chewing on what may have once been a scented meditation pillow. Karen herself emerged from the house wearing a flowing kaftan and holding a book titled Manifesting with Goat Energy. I had to pause the feed just to laugh. Owen zoomed the drone in silently, and we saw Karen set down a plate of what looked like sliced cucumbers and an oat biscuit near Darla. She's trying to bribe her, I muttered. With snacks. That's not manifesting. That's kidnapping with catering. We formed a plan. Ted would distract Karen by ringing the doorbell and pretending to be from the HOA's Emergency Ethics Committee. Owen would use the drone to signal Darla with a bellweed attached to the landing gear. Goats are smarter than people give them credit for, especially Darla, who had been trained to respond to that sound at feeding time. Once lured toward the side gate, I would slip in and guide her out before Karen even realized what was happening. It was going to be tight, but it was going to be glorious. As the sun dipped low and golden light stretched across the yard, we made our move. Ted rang the doorbell wearing a serious face and holding a clipboard. Karen answered, already suspicious. We've received multiple reports of livestock misconduct in this sector, Ted began. According to subsection 4C of the Emergency Moral Conduct Bylaw, Karen cut him off. What are you babbling about? I'm in the middle of a goat mediation session. Meanwhile, the drone hovered nearby, emitting the soft ring of Darla's feeding bell. Her ears perked. She turned her head, nostrils flaring like she'd just sniffed freedom. Owen nudged the drone closer. Darla took a few tentative steps. Karen was now ranting about how she had liberated the goat from an oppressive rural paradigm. Ted was nodding solemnly, scribbling fake note. I slipped through the unlocked side gate like a ghost, heart pounding, eyes locked on Darla. She saw me and bleated softly, her hooves already inching in my direction. I reached into my pocket and pulled out her favorite treat, apple slices dipped in molasses. She trotted to me like we were reuniting in a slow-motion movie montage. I clicked the leash onto her collar, and together we tiptoed through the hedges toward the waiting getaway truck. And then, just as I was loading Darla into the truck bed, Karen screamed. She had caught a glimpse of us in her side mirror. "You goat-thieving hillbillies!" she shrieked, sprinting across her garden with all the grace of a toddler in roller skates. "That goat is a patient in my emotional wellness clinic." Ted made a break for it. Owen brought the drone down fast and ran after us, clutching the controller like a trophy. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and we peeled out of her driveway with Darla in the back, staring regally at her former prison like a queen escaping a spa-themed dungeon. We got home, all of us laughing hysterically as Darla jumped down and strutted back to her pasture like she'd just returned from vacation. I was still high on adrenaline when my phone buzzed. Another message from Karen. This time it was a video file. I opened it cautiously. It was drone footage, but not ours. Somehow, Karen had managed to set up her own backyard surveillance, and in the footage, I was clearly seen slipping into her property, taking the goat and driving off. She had edited the clip, slowing it down and adding dramatic music, like some over-the-top crime documentary. The message attached read, "Hope the sheriff enjoys this as much as I did." She had gone full villain. Not just with fake permits and trespassing, but now manipulating footage to make it look like I stole my own goat. I called Ted and showed him the video. He sighed. "She's going to file charges. Or at least try to. But she's playing dirty now." I paced the kitchen, seething. "She thinks this will scare me. That she can twist everything and get away with it." Ted nodded slowly. "Then we fight dirty too. Let's dig into her HOA records. If she's faking permits and drawing illegal maps, there's got to be a paper trail. That night, while the neighborhood slept, Ted and I dove into the HOA archives. Documents he had copied onto an external drive before Karen could lock down access. We combed through emails, board meeting transcripts, spending reports, and internal memos. What we found was explosive. Karen had forged multiple digital signatures to approve development plans. She had funneled HOA funds into wellness retreat projects that didn't exist. She'd even billed the HOA for a goat Reiki session totaling $600. And tucked inside one folder was a scanned version of her HOA Wilderness Wellness Permit, complete with a watermark from a spa website and a signature from someone named Dr. Saffron Moonbeam. We had the smoking gun. Karen wasn't just a tyrant. She was a fraud. And now we had the evidence to prove it. I sat back, the laptop screen glowing, Darla gently snoring in the corner. This wasn't just about reclaiming stolen goats anymore. It was about ending Karen's reign once and for all. Karen doesn't go away. She mutates. It had been 5 days since we exposed her goat theft, dug through her fraudulent HOA records, and prepared our case for the neighborhood council. She had gone radio silent, no emails, no doorbell rants, no unhinged flyers stuffed into mailboxes. It was like a storm that vanished too early, unsettling in the quiet. I knew better than to think it was over. Karen wasn't the type to retreat. She was the type to regroup. And sure enough, on the 6th morning, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of tarp flapping in the wind. There, in the same exact spot on my back pasture where she had first trespassed, stood a brand new tent. But this time it was bigger, heavier, reinforced. The new tent looked like it had been designed for a survivalist in the apocalypse. Steel frame poles, double-layered canvas, solar panels on one side. A wind chime shaped like an angel blowing a trumpet dangled from the entrance. She had even added a small generator, its low hum barely audible over the sound of my chickens reacting in confused protest. Karen stood outside, watering a potted plant as if she hadn't just invaded my land a second time with military-grade camping equipment. When she saw me, she gave a smug little wave. "Namaste," she said. "I'm back." And this time I filed all the paperwork. I didn't respond. I just stared at her, silently calculating whether the county sheriff would arrest me for turning a hose on someone twice. Instead of going nuclear immediately, I took the diplomatic route. I contacted Ted and updated him. He showed up within the hour, glanced at the tent, and said, "This is some next-level delusion." Karen was now claiming that since there was an ongoing HOA investigation into rural expansion, she was occupying the space as a temporary site assessor for therapeutic land use. She handed Ted a folder filled with paperwork so heavily highlighted it looked like a kindergarten art project. He flipped through it, eyebrows rising. "She forged 3 new signatures," he said quietly. "2 of these people moved away last year. We couldn't let her keep pushing boundaries, literally and figuratively. So I upgraded my strategy. No more direct hose attack. This time it would be smarter, more elegant. I called in a favor from a friend who worked in agricultural tech. We installed motion-triggered sprinklers, top of the line, used to deter deer from entering vegetable plots. They were quiet, accurate, and had a range of nearly 30 feet. We rigged them around the pasture perimeter like a defensive ring. Any time Karen stepped outside her tent, splash. It wasn't violent. It was automated weather with a personality. The next morning, I didn't even have to leave the porch. Karen emerged from her fortress, holding what looked like a steaming mug of herbal tea. She took 1 step forward. The sprinkler clicked. A powerful jet of cold water hit her mid-shin and soaked her robe in under 2 seconds. She screamed and jumped back, sloshing tea everywhere. Another sprinkler triggered behind her, then another. It was like watching a soggy ballet of vengeance. She spun in circles trying to dodge the jets, yelling words like harassment and hydrological assault. But the sprinklers didn't care. They had one job and they did it with beautiful, impersonal precision. The neighborhood caught on quickly. A few folks brought lawn chairs. Bob from 2 farms over set up a little popcorn stand. Karen's Splash Zone, he called it. Someone started live streaming the sprinkler attacks, and the videos began circulating. My personal favorite was titled Karen vs. the Elements, Day 3. Each time she emerged to fight nature, she retreated a little faster. But she refused to leave. Instead, she started putting up tarps. She tried building a canopy out of PVC pipes and pool floaties. Nothing worked. The sprinklers always found the gaps. Then, in a final desperate move, Karen marched to the HOA building, filed a restraining order claiming my land was emotionally aggressive, and announced she would be giving a public statement to set the record straight. The HOA board had no choice but to hold a meeting, and of course, everyone showed up. The community center was packed. People stood along the back wall. Darla sat near the front row, chewing hay with dramatic timing. Karen entered like a fallen monarch, dressed in flowing white and flanked by Helen and Greg, who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. She marched to the podium and began her speech, dramatically clutching a thick binder of printed screenshots and what she called evidence of rural tyranny. "I have been targeted," she declared. "This man unleashed weaponized irrigation on a peaceful camper. I was drenched while meditating, drenched while manifesting, drenched while trying to connect with my inner goat." The room was silent for a beat before someone coughed in a way that sounded suspiciously like laughter. She continued, flipping through her documents. "I was misled, harassed, and edited into viral shame." That was when Ted stood up. Calmly, clearly, and with the ease of someone holding all the cards, he projected the drone footage we had uncovered. Karen yelling at Darla. Karen slipping into her own compost pile. Karen forging names on zoning permit. The room went from tense to stunned. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Until the entire room was applauding, not for me or Ted, but for the sweet release of collective justice. Karen stood frozen, mouth open, hands gripping the binder so tightly it tore. This is manipulated," she screamed. "This is character assassination." But no one listened. Ted moved to the front, holding an official letter from the county. "The county planning board has reviewed the document. The wellness center is unlicensed, unapproved, and entirely fabricated. Karen has misused HOA funds, falsified permits, and illegally occupied private land." He paused. "Effective immediately, she is removed as president of the HOA." The room erupted. Karen tried one last time, her voice shrill. "You can't vote me out. I am the HOA." But Greg finally found his voice and stood up. "No, Karen. You were the HOA. Now you're just wet." She stormed out, tripping on her robe as she went, and disappeared down the hall like a cartoon villain defeated by plumbing. In the following weeks, peace returned. The tent disappeared. Karen put her house on the market and moved to a gated community 3 towns over. Rumor has it she's already trying to start a new HOA there, but the residents have goats and they've been warned. We held a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate. Ted was declared honorary president until a real election could be held. Bob made sprinkler-shaped cookies. Owen flew his drone in loop-de-loops over the pasture. And Darla? She got a gold collar and a tiny plaque that said local hero. One morning, weeks later, as the sun crept over the barn and the dew glistened on the grass, my rooster crowed. The world was quiet. No tent, no threats, just chickens, goats, and neighbors who finally remembered how to laugh again. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, and smiled. This time, when the rooster crowed, nobody else screamed back.